in a lot of cases this time of the year, a lot of people have financial commitments to make, whether it's machinery, land and all the rest of it, that you could see where a spot price, if someone comes on wanting to sell movement next day or payment by the end of the month, that you could see a depressed market there. If there's a better price to be had 3 months ahead, I would argue that sellers should be looking at taking those sort of prices.
With the harvest complete, all farmers now have a clear idea of the total tonnage of grain available for sale. For most, the process is relatively straightforward. The grain is either sold in a forward market position in September or October, or maybe later in the year, or all at once post-harvest. However, other options are available, allowing farmers to defer the sale of grain for several weeks or months through their merchant. Have you considered the market trends in the coming months and how you plan to sell your grain? You are listening to the latest episode of The Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. Having a sense of the total grain production and harvest to come will greatly affect forward prices in the coming months. I caught up with James Nolan, a grain trader at Barnett-Hall, who shared some insights on the current grain market and where it might be heading over the next few weeks and months.
I guess if you're looking back, we saw the lows very end of February, early March, and I guess it was really driven from last harvest, and we saw huge crops in the Black Sea, particularly on wheat. And I guess for a market, the evolution of a market is harvest pressure in August, September, and generally markets tend to rise during the season. Last year was the opposite, where Russia, being a major producer, they produced a record 90 plus million tonnes of wheat. And seasonally, Russia would tend to push very, very hard for July, August, September. And once you get into the winter months, they tend to slow down on their exports. And kind of Western exporters, US, Europe, and even then Australia in the new year tend to step in. And usually markets tend to rise for these more mature markets. Last year, that never happened. You basically had Russia just were very, very aggressive sellers right through the whole year. And most other countries in the world were waiting for Russia to exhaust themselves. And as prices continue to fall, particularly in the EU, and the Irish scenario was mirrored across the EU, farmers didn't like falling prices and they waited and waited. And once we got into the new year, I guess it was people just threw in the towel. And what they did is we need finance, potential storage, and in February, March, there was a lot of European selling. And
just get out of the market
just to try get it, just pushed and pushed very, very hard. And I guess the sellers exhausted themselves then for a period. And once we got into the spring planting season, where we had a very late spring across Europe, you saw reduced plantings in the UK, Baltics, France, and all of a sudden we got into a summer weather market. We saw even in Russia, Ukraine, where we saw very high temperatures, very, very dry weather in the months of May, and we saw the seasonal, inverted commas, weather market that always moves into May. And if it's a real weather market, it tends to just go on fire in June. But the market, I guess, this year, global demand has been an issue. The market kind of rallied up in May, and it was never followed through with kind of major weather issues where crops started to develop probably much, much better than we all thought.
So you got a quick bump and then it petered out a bit again, and it's
correct.
It's probably come back a little bit, but what we might do is, and we heard a lot about it today, you might maybe just give us a little bit of a summary maybe across the world in terms of the overall production. Is it up or down this year, or kind of where is it across the world? Because obviously Ireland is only mediocre. England didn't have a great year. We know Northern Europe may be close to us. We've been talking to other people, and it's not maybe that great. What's it like in the rest of the world?
Well, I guess taking in isolation something like wheat, there is a big issue with quality wheats. So the milling wheats across the world are arguably in tight supply. Europe as a whole have a much smaller crop. So Europe as a whole, and including the UK, production probably started about 138 million, and now that's as low as 124 million. Even the UK, where they produce on average maybe 15 million tonnes, their crop could be as low as 11 million. And for the UK is actually a net importer of wheat this year, where they're traditionally an exporter of between 2 and 3 million tonnes. So that's a dynamic where there's probably the demand in Northwest Europe is probably quite good, but globally demand is an issue. And Russia, they seem to have a big crop again this year, and at the moment they are very, very aggressive sellers, and they continue to sell at quite low prices relative to other exporting regions. It is beginning to change for wheat, where there is an expectation that maybe Russian government may look at restricting exports, mainly because it's very, very dry and autumn plantings are being delayed. So if the plantings are reduced maybe by, currently people talk about maybe 5 to 10% because it's too dry, the Russian government, you're looking at local inflation, may look at curtailing exports maybe before the end of the year, and that could be very positive for other exporting regions. Europe, but the problem for Europe is, do they have the quality wheat on milling? But it's a positive maybe for world prices that the cheapest exporter, the cheapest origin, if they restrict their exports, their prices should increase, and as a result, a rising tide, other world prices could rise for wheat in particular.
But of course you have the other side of the market, which is maize, which is probably more influential probably in the Irish price. So what's the maize thing globally looking like?
Globally, I think maize is going to be very, very interesting this year. Globally, there is going to be very, very big crops. Like the US is one where it's unimaginable. They're going to produce a record crop, and they're about 30% through harvest, and these big yields appear to be realised.
300 bushels we heard today?
300 bushels.
What's that, 16 tonnes an acre?
No. 3 per hectare. It's about 7.5 tonnes an acre. And the average there, it's phenomenal. It is phenomenal. Like the US average yield is 180 bushels, and it's forecast to be 183 to 4 bushels per acre this year. Last year was a record at 177. So it is big. Like the average there is about 4.6 tonnes, which it is quite big. Big crops in the US. Brazil, they've pretty much harvested. They're actually going back into planting, which is dry, but Brazil have a crop about 110, 115 million tonnes. Canada are going to move into harvest in the coming weeks. Their area is probably up about 300,000 acres this year. But Canada, US, they've seen a lot of restriction. The farmer is not willing to sell. So there's a fear on the other side, the consumer saying, well, we'll just wait for this farmer to sell. And as was said today, demand globally seems to be a concern, and the Chinese growth seems to be in decline, and more so China are one of the biggest purchasers of US ags in recent years. They've been moving away, probably politically driven, but also price, with where Brazil has become a major supplier into the Asian market. And
the other one we heard today, which has a big influence on Irish prices as well, is around soybean. And what was talked about today is Brazil, and the volumes of soybean that's pumping out now is just mind-boggling.
It is mind-boggling. Like, you consider last year Brazil produced, was it a record of 147 million tonnes? Mind you, they're only starting to plant. But one of our speakers today just suggested that they could produce 170 to 175 million tonnes of soybeans, which it's really unimaginable. And even a speaker made a comment about even bringing, 17, 18 million hectares into production, and that's without actually touching rainforest. Brazil is just, it's scary to think of their output potential.
So when you look at it in the round, then just again listen to some of the speakers as they were talking about in terms of stocks to use ratio. It's not alarming yet in terms of being really bad, but it seems to be quite comfortable.
Yes, I think possibly if you take in isolation wheat, I think globally is quite tight.
Okay.
Quite tight. The problem is Russia. I shouldn't say problem, but Russia is the catalyst, and they are the price setter, and their current crop is still going to be, if not the second, definitely the third biggest crop on record. So they have a lot to produce. I think on wheat, we have moved out of harvest pressure. I'd be more confident of prices stabilising here, maybe seeing slight increase, and probably the increase really comes from delayed plantings in the Black Sea region because of dryness, and even parts of northwest Europe now because of very wet weather. We may see kind of France and parts of Germany area. I'm not saying it will decline, but I think it will be delayed planting. Corn, on the other hand, globally is very, very well supplied.
Okay. So James, before we get closer to home in terms of where things might go, maybe necessarily, we also heard today talk around the EU deforestation criteria that's now underpinning or will underpin in the future some of those commodities which are being exported across the world. Is that likely to, you might explain a little bit about it first in terms of what does that mean, I suppose, but is that likely to add costs to some of those things coming in, some of those commodities coming in?
Well, firstly, the EUDR's EU directive to basically reduce the need to import certain products, certain commodities from regions of deforestation. And it's basically, for our industry, soya is a big one, but beef is included, coffee, timber, and basically what is happening is the product coming into the EU will have to be proven that it is not coming from a deforested area. So basically, something like soya beans, if it's coming into Europe, the idea will be to track it right back to a specific field. And that is all imports into the EU. So even soybeans or soybean meal for us that is being crushed in a US plant, coming from a US field in the Midwest, it has to be proven that where it came from, whether that is US, Brazil, Argentina. And the biggest concern for the EU market is it is not set up to manage that or even document it. So it's in legislation that is to come in from the 1st of January 2025, but there is now a vote going, it's going to take place the end of November, that they propose that they will suspend it for 12 months. And back to the costs, yes, there is added cost. Firstly is Europe imports approximately 30 million tonnes of, say, soybean meal. It is argued that the world is not set up to, or Europe does not have the ability to source 100% of their EUDR material. So what has to happen there is you have to find more material that is EUDR, whether that's going to add cost because the product is probably there, but the procedures are not in place. So whether it's admin, whether it is logistics, secondly is if the price goes up, it may force certain users within EU to look at alternative proteins in the case for soybean meal. So the short of it is a cost. Now, how much is that cost? Is it €1 per tonne or is it 50 or 60 euros per tonne? It's hard to say, but
there will be a cost somewhere.
Exactly.
Somebody has to pay for it.
Correct.
Yeah, and it's and I can imagine we find it hard to track 2 million tonnes here, never mind 30 million tonnes coming from across the world. So it's going to be tricky. But and it's interesting, and I suppose people just need to be aware of that kind of coming through the system, both from the point of view of tillage farmers kind of saying our grain is brilliant here in Ireland, but Jesus, when you got that traceability from stuff coming abroad, it's kind of puts it up to us, I suppose, a bit in that sense as well. Coming back a little bit closer to home in terms of the markets that are around here at the moment, obviously we import a lot of feed, but we produce a lot as well. What sort of cover do feeders have at the moment? Are they well covered up for the next 2 or 3 months, or what way are they?
For the next 2 or 3 months, depending on what would be considered normal demand, I think on cereals, consumers they're probably 50 to 70% covered. Now, what we have experienced this summer, particularly July, August and even September, like feed demand has been very, very strong. So if somebody has been making a budget, say last May, it has been, there's nobody who was budgeting for the demand they've seen. I guess the driver to that is just weather and, good output prices. So if we see elevated demand going forward here, which is probably argued that should happen again, dairy prices are quite strong, beef prices are quite good. There's going to be, I guess, a question mark over the likes of maize silage and its quality. So if consumers have to maybe feed more concentrates, I don't think the market has as much cover as you would be forecasting today. But in saying that, probably customers are, in general, probably normal cover, probably 60, maybe 70%.
Okay, so there's a bit more to go on it.
There certainly is.
Okay. Final question, James, and again, sorry for keeping you from your customers, and there's a good night ahead, as they say, but we've had one merchant come out with a price so far in terms of the barley price. We're all waiting for the major buyers to come out. What do you expect? Do you expect something similar, or do you expect maybe something a little bit more juicy to come out still?
What I say, the market always needs feeding. Right, animals are never going to go hungry. So if someone has something in their store that don't want to say, they'll say, well, nobody else has it, they'll have to come to me. I don't believe that's the case, and I think probably particularly in the next few months is where I could see a challenge in general is with, if the cover is much higher than 70%, I do feel that maybe placing product on the market could be a challenge. And I think it's something that I guess marketeers of their grain need to be more focused on, is actually placing grain in the market. And when I say that, kind of committing to positions in the future, whether it's a week, a month, 3 months ahead. If nothing else, if it's got to do with physical movement, or in a lot of cases this time of the year, a lot of people have financial commitments to make, whether it's machinery, land and all the rest of it, that you could see where a spot price, if someone comes on wanting to sell movement next day or payment by the end of the month, that you could see a depressed market there. And I do think I would say if there's a carry in the forwards, so if there's a better price to be had 3 months ahead, I would argue that sellers should be looking at taking those sort of prices.
James, thanks very much for your time. Delighted to have you again.
No problem. Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to James for joining me on the show. If you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.